Hello, everyone. I'm Ping Liang, a past board president of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. Welcome to the fourth program of Great Decision Series 2014. If you're not a World Affairs Council members yet, we welcome you and we encourage you to join our email membership for $10 a year. The membership desk will be open after the program ends, so you can sign up. And if you join tonight, as you know, you will be able to enjoy the Great Decision programs for the rest of the season for only $5 each time. If you are not ready to join us yet, we would still encourage you to sign up for our no obligation event notice email blast in the lobby after the program ends tonight. We're also selling this Great Decision textbook. As many of you know, this is a great resource in the lobby for $20 each book, and it's really fabulous, and I'm sure you will enjoy it. Please join me in thanking tonight's program sponsor, Grand Rapids Community College. Now about tonight's armchair discussion. We expect a very lively discussion. The US and Israel have a 65 history of supporting each other and becoming ever more aligned. But sometimes, just like good friends, we have a squabble or two. The importance that the US places on this relationship can be epitomized by this. Some of you will remember when our council decided to bring in world leaders here to Grand Rapids, Michigan, our first guest was Ehud Barak. And just after he stepped down as Israel's prime minister, and if you remember, he visited us just 3 weeks after 9/11. And he gave us a very healing message. He assured us that Israel's prayer, caring, and deep friendship were with us, and that we would certainly overcome that tragedy. Now, let me turn this discussion over to Dr. Mike DeVivo from Grand Rapids Community College. He is the moderator for tonight's program, and he will also introduce Dr. Aronoff, and she will begin the program on tonight's topic, U.S.-Israeli relations in a changing Middle East. Please, Dr.
Thank you.
DeVivo.
Thank you very much. You're a superstar. I was first introduced to Dr. Aronoff several years ago without her knowing about it because my daughter was studying international relations at the James Madison College at MSU, and she kept talking about her, and I realized that it wasn't long before she would become her favorite professor, which she became. And so I then was able to meet her finally several years later, which was just a few months ago, and could understand certainly why she was my daughter Amelia's favorite professor. Some of you might know that Dr. Aronoff received a great teaching award, and she has done so much work in terms of her research in international relations and currently is devoting much of her time in reference to political psychological matters and certainly Israel-Palestinian issues. I could go on, but I won't bore you. We came here to listen to Dr. Aronoff talk, and so here she is. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. And so I didn't realize the history with Yael Aronoff coming here, but I know you've had a series of very famous people, so I'm coming here, so I'm humbled to come here as well in the wake of them. So I'm pleased to see that there's so many people interested in U.S.-Israeli relations and how they've evolved. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be walking you through in 20 minutes, hopefully, the relationship over the past 65 years, what the bases of the relationship are in terms of affinity for both peoples for each other, the support in the United States for Israel and self-determination when Israel was created and so forth, the trade between the two countries, and then especially in the aftermath of the 1967 war and the 1973 war, the really kind of special relationship that was formed, which was first coined by President Kennedy. So we'll walk through that, but we're also going to look at, as was mentioned, a couple of the tensions in the relationship over the past few years, which have centered. Yeah, sure. I'm so loudly. You probably hear me anyway, right? Now, do you hear me better now? Okay, sorry. Should I repeat myself? No. Okay. So there are these couple tensions. Some of them are kind of personality tensions and ideological tensions between Obama and Netanyahu that I'll be talking a little bit about. A couple of them are tensions that even though the United States and Israel share the common goals of supporting a two-state solution and a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and they share the common goals of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, that they don't always see exactly eye to eye on getting to those goals, especially in the past few years. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll talk about kind of prospects for the future and how, in 15, 20 minutes, prospects for the future and why I think there's a reason to believe that the relationship will only be strengthened and has been strengthened during the past 3 years of the uprisings in the Middle East. But that certainly that will only become realized, I think, once we have an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement that really will ensure a stronger relationship in the future. So as many of you know, the U.S. was one of the first to recognize Israel when it was established in 1948. But there was kind of differences of opinion as to what this might mean for U.S. strategic interests. And the U.S. actually had an arms embargo against all countries in 1948, including Israel. So while Britain was providing arms to Jordan and Iraq and others that were going to attack Israel in 1948, the U.S. kind of stood in the lines and really didn't provide that much economic or military support until after 1967 war and 1973 war. Now, from the beginning, if you look at opinion polls, the affinity of Americans for Israel was very high. So often right at the time of the establishment of the state, certainly after it was attacked by several countries in 1948, the empathy for Israel was very high, and support was about 75% among Americans from the very start of the establishment of the country. So you had all along this kind of American affinity, which you could argue was partially over sympathy for the persecution of Jews over the years that was highlighted in the Holocaust, and perhaps that has something to do with it, perhaps the Judeo-Christian traditions that were in common and kind of a familiarity with the Jewish story in terms of the Bible that comes out of the United States, and other such matters, and of course, kind of an affinity for fellow democracies, democratic values, democratic institutions, and it was the only democracy in the Middle East. And all of those things in terms of values, I think, help explain the tremendous American support among the people for Israel for its first 20 years of creation. But that political support and affinity was not matched by economic and military support. It was actually France in the 50s that was Israel's main supporter in terms of the military. And it's only once kind of within the Cold War context of the the competition between the US and Soviet Union that Israel kind of proved itself to be a worthy ally and a strategic partner to the United States. So that when it had intelligence that was going to be attacked in a matter of hours or days, with the aim then evolving into the destruction of the country, and mass graves were built in Israel at the time. In anticipation of this, there was a preemptive war whereby Israel essentially beat the Soviet Union's clients in the war, including Egypt and Syria and others. And so the United States thought, oh, they're beating Soviet clients, and this might be fruitful for us in the Cold War context. Then in 1973, of course, Israel was attacked by the Soviet Union's clients again, Syria and Egypt. It beat those countries, and that's when really the strategic value of Israel as an ally in the Middle East kind of bore fruit within this Cold War context. It was aided by other things. For instance, in 1970, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was headquartered in Jordan. It started controlling much of the territory, and threatening the Hashemite kingdom's rule in Jordan. Jordan started cracking down. It asked the U.S. for help. The U.S. was very involved in Vietnam and other places, was already overextended, thought it was very important in the U.S.-Soviet competition to help one of its allies in the region, Jordan. Syria attacked Jordan. The U.S. felt overextended, and it asked Israel to essentially be willing to put all their troops at Jordan's border and defend Jordan in front of the Syrian attack, which Israel did. It put all its forces at Jordan's border. That alone caused Syria to retreat in the wake of its defeat in 67. And Jordan expressed its appreciation to Israel, as did the U.S. And so those, among other factors, kind of solidified the value of having an ally, Israel, that's not only a democracy, that not only American support, but within the context of the Cold War is also an ally, right? And so given those facts, that's kind of the background for why all administrations have decided that Israel, in the face of enemies that it has in the region, must have a qualitative military edge compared to its neighbors, or a combination of its neighbors, since it was attacked by a combination in 48, thought it was going to be attacked in 67, was in 73. The feeling was, okay, a lot of these states that are attacking Israel are backed by the Soviet Union, therefore we need to make sure that our ally in the region, if it were attacked in the future, would be able to beat either one or a combination of these forces. And since at that time, in 67, Israel was a country of 2.5 million people, size of New Jersey. Now it's, almost quadrupled to the large number of 8 million, but it's dwarfed by the size and populations of the countries that surround it, whether it's Egypt or Iran or Syria and elsewhere. So therefore, since it doesn't have the manpower or the geography to be able to necessarily prevent and win in future attacks, the United States decided it has to assure that Israel has a qualitative military edge, which led to what we have now, which is $3.1 billion a year of military aid to Israel, practically all of which has to be spent on military equipment, more than 75% of which has to be spent on buying American military equipment, so the money comes back into the United States for that, some of which Israel can spend on its own research and development for its own military. And that's kind of the basis and rationale for that strategic relationship. You also have this kind of really growth of economic relations between the two countries. So in 1985, Israel was the very first, the United States and Israel were the very first countries that had a free trade agreement. A lot of countries didn't want to take the risk at that time of putting the barriers down. Israel said, we will. And that became the model for lots of future free trade agreements. And now you have over $35 billion of trade between the two countries, a lot of scientific, agricultural, economic cooperation. You have 10 states in the United States who have offices in Israel for investment and trade. You have in 50 states 850 collaborative projects with both American and Israeli scientists in medicine and science and so ever. Israel is, some of you probably read The Startup Nation, but it has the most startup, high-tech, and computer and medicine companies per capita in the world. It's kind of the Silicon Valley, as more than the Silicon Valley in California. So Intel does its research there. It's done so many innovations in terms of computers, cell phones, medicine, right? So my dad's life was actually saved by this little pill that you can swallow that takes thousands of pictures as it goes down your intestines and can find cancers that other means can't find. It has ecoskeleton systems for people who have been paralyzed to allow them to get up and walk. Really amazing things. And so there's a lot going on in that realm. But precisely because of the tremendous economic growth in Israel, since 2008, the U.S. no longer provides economic aid to Israel. It's now a member of the OECD. It's now number 17 in the world in terms of the UN Human Development Index. So it no longer needs U.S. economic aid, and that is no longer part of the picture. So this is the kind of the context from which we're coming. So let's look at a couple of the tensions that we've been hearing about in the relationships over the past few years. And part of it, as with any kind of alliance and any kind of friendship, it sometimes matters who the leaders are in both countries and to what extent their ideologies are aligned, to what extent they have personal chemistry. So over the years, when you have, let's say, a Democratic American president on one hand and a Labor Party prime minister on the other hand, who generally are more willing to make larger concessions and more urgently pursue peace agreements with the Palestinian Authority, I'm talking about the Labor Party in particular, then you have closer personal relationships among the leaders, which happened with George W. Bush and Israeli Prime Minister Sharon and Olmert, who are of the Likud and then the Kadima parties. You had that between Clinton and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and then Ehud Barak, who they were all involved in negotiations for peace together. Yitzhak Rabin who was, of course, part of the Oslo process in 1993, for which he and Shimon Peres and Arafat won the Nobel Peace Prize in order to start a peace process. Rabin was Clinton's favorite leader of all the leaders in the world. In his Oval Office, he had several pictures of Rabin. He said that Rabin was the person he admired most, not just the leader he admired most, the man he admired most in the world. This was reciprocated by Israelis. Clinton would come to Israel, and when Clinton came to Rabin's funeral, he ended it with Shalom Chaver, which means goodbye, friend. And practically every single car in Israel would have a sticker, a bumper sticker car saying Shalom Chaver, and they adored Clinton. Clinton was more popular in Israel than he was in the United States. So you have had times when the relationships are extremely close, and then you have times where there are different political parties, somewhat different personalities, and you don't get that closeness, right? So Netanyahu, when he was first prime minister from 1996 to 1999 of the Likud party, had a lot of friction with the Clinton administration at that time because Clinton didn't think he was working urgently enough to try to follow the Oslo process. And I can happy to take questions about that afterwards if you'd like. And similarly with Obama and Netanyahu, you have different visions in terms of the urgency of reaching a peace agreement and what will need to be conceded to reach a peace agreement, which they differed over, even though they agree with the goal. You also had differences, okay, in terms of tactics of getting there. So Obama thought, well, you know, Clinton and Ehud Barak and Arafat tried to reach a final agreement in Camp David in 2000. It fell through. Maybe we need to build trust on the ground and have confidence-building measures and therefore have Israel freeze settlements. So Israel more or less froze settlements for 10 months in the West Bank, but not in East Jerusalem. Not a whole progress was made, and therefore Netanyahu, with his right-wing coalition at the time, decided not to renew those freezing of settlements, which caused friction between Obama and Netanyahu and other things. I think that now things are patching up. They both try to, in a way, undermine each other politically in their respective countries. So Netanyahu appealed to Republicans in the United States and tried to help them. And Obama, on the other hand, knew that Netanyahu was not the best Israeli leader to quickly get a peace agreement and made it clear in terms of the January 2013 race whom he supported, and it wasn't Netanyahu. So they both had disgruntlement in terms of both guys trying to undermine each other domestically, politically. But when they were both reelected, they thought, okay, we got to deal with each other. It became a much more constructive relationship, and now they usually air their differences in private as opposed to in public. And of course, Obama came to Israel in March and really asserted, again, appealed to the Israeli public, asserted his deep connection to Israel as a Jewish state, he says, an unshakable relationship, in his words, between the US and Israel. So that, of course, tensions remain, but that has improved. Then, of course, the second policy area where there are differences of opinion is Iran, of course. And the United States has almost equal tension, I would say, between their two strongest Middle East allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, on the issue of Iran. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran face a graver threat from Iran, given their proximity to Iran, than does the United States. And that explains a lot, I think, on its own. So therefore, Saudi Arabia, even though it had lobbied to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, refused publicly in a protest to the United States, in fact, to do that, partially because of their dissatisfaction with what they see as coddling Iran too much and getting into negotiations too quickly, etc., on one hand, and secondarily, they were disappointed with the U.S., in their view, dropping too quickly their 30-year ally of Mubarak on one hand, and on the other hand, not doing enough to support the rebels in Syria. So Saudi Arabia has these three sources of friction with the United States in the past couple of years, and that's why Obama next month is visiting Saudi Arabia in order to paper over those kind of tensions with its strong ally, right? By the way, which we, in 2010, signed a $60 billion military equipment deal with Saudi Arabia, right? In order to balance Iran in the region, because Saudi Arabia relies on the United States for its security. So likewise with Israel, like Saudi Arabia, given their proximity, given, of course, the rhetoric of Ahmadinejad, who often claimed that he wanted to destroy Israel, so you have that intention, plus potential capacity, which I think understandably made a lot of Israelis very nervous, since Iranian missiles can hit Israel, but they cannot hit the United States. On the other hand, there was a lot of disagreement within the Israeli government as to, therefore, what to do. So a lot of people who were retired from the security establishment and intelligence establishment in Israel, or who are current members of the military establishment or intelligence establishment, said, yes, indeed, Iran is the greatest threat to Israel, but that the Israel should hold off on any limited military strikes on Iran, give economic sanctions and negotiations a chance to work, and not work without the green light of the United States. And that's where the majority of the Israeli public opinion is, in poll after poll after poll, that even though they perceive a great threat from Iran that becomes nuclear, they do not want to have their country engage in limited military strikes, at least without the green light and okay of their strongest ally, the United States, right? So you have continuing friction. Netanyahu doesn't want Iran to enrich uranium at all. There's disagreement as to at what point is most dangerous that we have to worry about, right? So many argue that right now, Iran is already at the nuclear threshold. It has 7.5 tons of enriched uranium, so that if it wanted to develop a nuclear bomb, it has enough already enriched uranium to develop 4 to 5 nuclear bombs in the next couple of years, and perhaps the first one within a short period, up to 3 months. Obama says, yes, this is true, but what we really have to be concerned about is the ability to fit that onto a missile, which is still 2 years away. So I think a lot of people are very hopeful. I know I certainly am very hopeful about the comprehensive negotiations that are taking place right now between the US and Iran to change the relationship and to work things out diplomatically. Netanyahu is very skeptical of this. He thinks Iran is bent on, has already passed some of the thresholds, is bent on doing this, and doesn't trust Iran in this matter. He has publicly expressed his skepticism, but it's a fait accompli, and he said, okay, I'll just try in the sidelines to try to shape that comprehensive agreement. So those are some of the tensions that are there. But I think as we look to the future, I think that given the uprisings in the Middle East in the past 3 years, I think things are leaning towards creating an even stronger relationship between the US and Israel for a variety of reasons. If you look at American public opinion polls, in February 2010, the Gallup poll showed that 67% of Americans viewed Israel in a very favorable or mostly favorable light. That went up 5 points in the past 4 years of the instability of the Middle East to 72%. So perhaps Americans are thinking, given the difficulties of creating democracy in the region, the wars and instability, although we're all hoping for democracies in the region, but given that it's not all working out quickly and positively, they value Israel as a fellow democracy even more. Perhaps. So that's in terms of public opinion. In terms of military aid, Obama has increased military aid to Israel. They have funded the new David sling that they're working on, the new Arrow missile that in the last operation between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip in November 2012, an 8-day operation, it apparently prevented 400 rockets from hitting their targets in Israel and had about an 80% effectiveness rate. This was co-developed by the United States and Israel. I think it's a good thing. I think it's one of the reasons Israel left after 8 days, didn't stay longer. About a tenth as many Palestinians were killed in that operation as the operation in Kasled 2 years before, and it's precisely because of this very expensive system, which costs $100,000 a battery in order to stop each rocket. So a rocket can cost $5, $10 to make. In order to intercept it in the sky is $50,000 to $100,000. This is expensive, but I think it actually can avoid military incursions and troops on the ground and make Israel feel more secure. So we can talk about that if you'd like. But the U.S. has put more money into those systems in the past 4 years and so forth. I still think, though, that there are some who are saying, okay, Israel was a great strategic ally during the context of the Cold War, but the Cold War is over. Perhaps it's not as necessary as a strategic ally today. And certainly the perception in the Middle East among some is that, the U.S. isn't doing enough to pressure Israel to reach a peace agreement, which contributes to anti-U.S. sentiment in the region. So some people are certainly questioning that, right, which we can talk about as well. I think as a whole, Israel remains a very useful strategic ally for the United States for a variety of reasons. One is the U.S. stores a lot of its military equipment in Israel and can use it as a base anytime it wants. Two, even though the Cold War is over, Russia is increasing its involvement in the Middle East, often in contravention to U.S. interests. So, for instance, now it's heavily supporting the Assad regime, which the U.S. Thinks is illegitimate, has killed over 100,000 Syrians, and it wants overturned. So Russia is working at cross purposes with the United States in Syria, is giving a whole lot of military equipment and aid and advice to Syria, and so you still have a strategic ally in the balance of power between the U.S. and Russia. Of course, the U.S. still perceives, I hope this will change the U.S.-Iranian relationship through this comprehensive agreement. I think we all would hope for a much better relationship with this long-standing enemy. But until that changes, the U.S. still perceives Iran as its greatest enemy in the Middle East. And Israel, along with its other allies, such as Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, are allied with the United States in trying to balance Iranian power in the region. And the U.S. certainly relies heavily on that. And the U.S. often doesn't have to put as many troops in there to deter Iranian power or to fight the proxies of Iran, like Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Hamas, because Israel is doing it. And it benefits U.S. interests. So I think there are a lot of reasons why the strategic value and relationship will continue. However, right, you still have questions raised in terms of the fact that there's no still peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. They have a continued Israeli occupation of the West Bank, which contributes to Palestinian suffering and at times human rights violations. And there's certainly something that's very important, I think, to talk about and to put on the agenda that concerns many people, that concerns many more younger people on university campuses, and does contribute to anti-U.S. sentiment in the region. So I think it would be necessary in order for the relationship to strengthen further to actually have a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. I think I'm an eternal optimist, but I think there's some signs of hope here. Secretary of State Kerry has restarted negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority since July 29th or July 31st. Over the summer, they've been negotiating for several months, and now he's put his framework of principles on the table and is pushing in a very, I think, admirable, persistent way to try to get both parties on board, more or less, with these principles so that they can move towards getting a comprehensive peace agreement themselves. I'm hopeful because he's very determined. I'm hopeful because Obama went to Israel in March and really spoke to the Israeli public as well as to the Palestinian public. I'm hopeful because unlike Prime Minister Netanyahu's first term, in his second term, in which he was elected in January 2013, there were more center parties that entered the coalition, which gives them a little more flexibility to make progress on the peace agreement. So I don't think that this is going to happen overnight, but I certainly am hopeful that there's room for progress to be made, which will then enable the U.S.-Israeli relationship, as well as the U.S.-Palestinian relationship, by the way. And Palestinian Authority has been a beneficiary of $500 million of U.S. aid every year and support and training for their security forces. So I think it can be a win-win situation, and I'm happy to take questions and talk to you more about it.
Well, thank you so very much. You've certainly put a lot on our plate. I'm telling you. I mean, that was a wonderful exposure to current conditions.
Since I can talk
with
for
great
hours, it was good that I kept
historical
it short.
background.
Tried to keep it short. Yeah.
I recall when we talked about, 4 or 5 months ago, we raised the point of the current prime minister perhaps having been strongly influenced by his father. And his father had just passed away probably just a couple, 3 weeks before we talked, and I believe you indicated that there were some views that related that maybe with the father's passing, Benjamin Netanyahu would become more amenable to engage in more difficult negotiations. Have you seen any evidence of that in the last 4 or 5 months?
Here and there, perhaps. I mean, he still comes from a Likud ideology whose historical context is in revisionist Zionism, which historically wanted to keep what they call Judea and Samaria, what many people call the West Bank, in Israel's hands. So he comes from an ideological tradition that was, unlike the Labor Party, which was very historically tied to the territories having been part of historical Israeli sovereignty 3,000 years ago, right? So, therefore, his ideology made him more reluctant to concede land. And since 2009, he says he supports a two-state solution and is willing to concede most of Judea, Samaria, or the West Bank. So he has made that concession. He also comes from kind of a family background, and I think in terms of personality, in which there's a focus on historical persecution on Jews, and certainly his father was an academic who wrote, I think, a 1,000-page treatise on the persecution of Jews in Spain, even after they were pressured to convert to Christianity, and many of them converted to Christianity. They were still persecuted, and so this kind of shaped his worldview as well. And he has a real skepticism towards and suspicion of other motives and interests, and this carries over to the Palestinian Authority and Abu Mazen. I think, unfortunately, because there's been actually excellent security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority over the past few years. So I think, he comes from a place in which there is a healthy skepticism, both because of his ideology and some of his personal traits, but he is kind of moving forward. He did release several dozen Palestinian political prisoners, most of whom had killed Israeli non-combatants, as a confidence-building measure to get to negotiations in July. There are rumors that he's willing to have a de facto freezing of settlements on most of the West Bank, although he's not willing to make it official, but rather de facto because of the coalition he's in now. And so he is making some concessions from his point of view in order to build some confidence, and we'll see if it's enough to really get the negotiations going.
It's very interesting because this is his second time in office, and he has certainly proved to make a number of impacts, though I think you mentioned in an earlier talk that he received a very small share of the vote, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting situation for in Israeli politics. For those of you who don't follow it, of course, they have a parliamentary system, democratic system, like many European countries, as opposed to our presidential system. And it has one of the lowest voter thresholds in the world. So if you can get 2% of people to support you, you can create your own political party. So you have so many political parties competing in an election, over 20, that the votes get really spread out, so that the person whose party gets the most votes gets to try to form a coalition and become prime minister, but it doesn't mean that they have the support of the majority of the population, right? So I think I should know, I was going to check and didn't, that I don't know if anybody knows, Netanyahu got, I think, about 28%, 29% of the vote in January 2013. So it's much less than our presidential candidates get because there's only two parties, more or less, really competing often. So, you know, he's gotten more votes than the other parties, but doesn't have the support of most of the population. And that's because partly economic issues and other issues were on the plate of many Israelis rather than foreign policy issues. And it's unfortunately because both Israelis and Palestinians, even though most of them very much support a two-state solution and most Israelis support evacuating most of the West Bank and most settlements in the West Bank, each side is very skeptical about the other side's genuine interest in reaching a peace agreement, which leaves both populations very disillusioned. And because they're disillusioned that it's not happening anytime soon, certainly with Hamas ruling the Gaza Strip since 2007, which opposes a two-state solution, it means that he got more of the vote than other candidates, even though most of the population supports getting out of settlements and getting out of the West Bank.
It's very, very difficult, I think, for Americans to wrestle with that concept, and I appreciate you explaining it rather well. And given that, we can look backward at the relationship that the U.S. and Israel have had, especially since the Cold War, the 73 Yom Kippur War, the later period of time when there were negotiations that President Carter served as a significant arbitrating force, and then some. Let's go to 73 for a minute. If I recall correctly, it seems to me that the Soviets were launching a massive supply effort in Damascus that really turned the tide in a way that compelled the U.S. to support Israel more than they had intended. It seems that there was a supply effort that met or exceeded the volume of shipments that were being used in the Berlin airlift in '48. And I think from what I gather, you're saying that this was really a pivot point in history in terms of the U.S. support of Israel.
It certainly was one of the pivot points. The United States didn't want to have its client, so to speak, lose to Soviet clients in the Middle East, otherwise, because the Soviet Union was making a lot of gains in the Middle East, and this would be, in terms of the way foreign policy was viewed at the time, kind of would have devastating impact for U.S. influence in the region. So I certainly remember the war very well. I was 5 years old in Israel during the war. We had been in the Golan Heights the day before the war. Had we been there the day after, I wouldn't be here today because there was a lot of fighting in the Golan Heights the very next day on the Yom Kippur War. So I spent it several days in a bomb shelter at the time and remember it vividly. It lasted about 3 weeks, the war, and initially Syria and Egypt made great gains in the Sinai and in the Golan, which restored some of their pride that was lost in what they see as the humiliation of 1967, which many people said they paved the way for Sadat to be able to negotiate with Israel in 1978, 1979. But certainly the Soviet Union was, Syria needed to be resupplied with weapons. The Soviet Union was doing that. Interestingly enough, the U.S. did resupply Israel with needed weapons at the first time, during the war, which was the first time it really had done something like this during a war. But interestingly, it delayed, intentionally delayed giving the weapons to kind of show Israel where it stood and try to get it to be more compliant with U.S. interests in the future. So it's kind of interesting the way the United States handled it. So it delayed giving the necessary military resupplies to Israel, but it did do so, allowing Israel to, win the war in 1973.
It's fascinating, certainly. And you brought up then the subsequent negotiations between Begin and Sadat that President Carter was deeply involved in. I suspect, though I don't know, I suspect that the Israelis that are seeking peace, as well as the Palestinians that are seeking peace, would like somebody like President Carter to come around.
Yeah, not everybody, but many people would like a push from the United States. Carter was very committed during Camp David. He put a lot of effort and energy into it. He did his homework. He basically didn't leave until an agreement was reached. And even though I was a political appointee in the Clinton administration, Clinton, could be critiqued for not doing quite the same thing in the Camp David Accords. He kind of left to go to Washington or Japan or something at one point during the negotiations, when the parties didn't immediately accept his, I think, very useful Clinton parameters or framework. At the beginning of the Camp David negotiations, he immediately withdrew them. And so he could have handled things better, and certainly wasn't the only reason why they didn't end up with agreement. But certainly I would argue, and many would argue, that because of the domestic situation among both Israelis and Palestinians, being that in Israel you have this coalition government with parties who are more reluctant to make concessions. On the Palestinian part, you have a divided community with Hamas ruling the Gaza Strip and Fatah ruling the West Bank, and sometimes Abu Mazen is not perceived as the strongest leader either. So because of both situations, you really do need a heavy American involvement to push the parties. There's already, everybody pretty much knows more or less what a peace agreement is going to look like for the past 14 years, and they've just been coming closer and closer. One of the main Palestinian negotiators, Saeb Erekat, I've interviewed him in Jericho. I've seen him in public forums in Jerusalem, and he said over and over again, we know what an agreement's going to look like. We basically just need the political will among leaders to deliver. And Shlomo Ben-Ami, the main Israeli negotiator at Camp David, says exactly the same thing. We know what we're going to basically have in an agreement, and we need America to push us to do it. So I think Kerry's pretty determined. He said once he gets something in his teeth, he doesn't let go, and I hope he doesn't. So.
Let me interrupt just for a moment. Please, if you have questions, come on up to the mics in the front or text 616-828-6261. One other question I have then, as we're looking at electing a president in a couple of years. Do you have a short list of individual potential candidates that the Israelis would prefer to see that would facilitate a peace agreement?
Yeah, I'm not so sure, and I should know more about what the list of candidates are. I know Hillary Clinton has been, up there as someone who may be running. I think after she was senator in New York, and given what she did while she was Secretary of State, I think most Israelis would be very happy to see her as president. I know I would love to see a female president for the first time, but we'll see. But generally speaking, there's deep bipartisan support in the United States for Israel. As you've probably noticed in presidential campaigns, each presidential candidate tries to outdo the other in their support from Israel during the campaign. And so Israel has it pretty good in terms of whoever gets elected, probably.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I just had a clarification question. Actually, maybe it's two questions. One was, you mentioned that the U.S. is no longer giving economic assistance to Israel, but we hear about the $3 billion that we're giving to the United States, so am I to assume that that's all military aid? And second of all, I was wondering if you could comment on the fact that in 1967, the Israeli military attacked the U.S. Navy, attacked the USS Liberty, killing 34 American sailors. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you accept the Israeli government's explanation that it was an accident, and if not, your speculation as to why they did it.
Right. So yeah, great questions. Sorry, your first question, now I remember your second question about the ship, but your first question.
Is the $3 billion purely military assistance?
Yeah, the $3.1 billion a year is all military assistance, and none of it is economic aid. And as I said, the vast majority of it Israel is required to purchase U.S. military equipment. So, for instance, it's purchasing F-35, I think, fighter jets, the new American fighter jet that I've heard there's controversy over lately in terms of how effective it is. But nevertheless, those jets are extremely expensive, and it's required essentially to buy American equipment, and with the rest, kind of develop its own kind of equipment as well, often in combination with the United States. So that's in terms of the aid. And Bush had a 10-year, $3.1 billion plan. Clinton wants to renew that continual year commitment. And even though there are always talk about budget cuts, it probably has a good probability of passing again for some of the reasons that I outlined here. Yeah, in the '67 war, there was that. I think it probably was a mistake. There's no reason on earth why Israel would, do that on purpose. I can't conceive of any reason why Israel would do that on purpose, since the U.S. is a strong ally and a great power in the world. It just doesn't make sense at all. Israel did approach the U.S., by the way, in the beginning of the war, when, again, it thought it was going to be imminently attacked, basically because it had only 2.5 million people, and it doesn't have many people in its military. It called all men in the country, almost all men in the country, to mobilize them and go on reserve, which means that the whole Israeli economy was on standstill for 2 to 3 weeks, and it couldn't continue being on that kind of alert. It couldn't economically afford being on that kind of alert, being such a small country with half its population now called up. So it twice sent messengers to the United States to try to get them to kind of open the blockade on the Straits of Tehran that Nasser had initiated, which Israel had interpreted as an act of war. By the way, the King Hussein of Jordan also said 100%, if Nasser does this, there's going to be war, and it is an act of war. So Israel approached the United States to try to get other countries to try to get it to just put a ship through to get it open, because Egypt wouldn't have challenged the U.S. then. Denmark, I think, thought about doing it, but hardly any countries want to do it. Essentially, the U.S. was very involved in Vietnam and didn't want to put something else on its plate. And then Israel felt like, okay, we can't wait any longer and do something. So perhaps there, was some resentment of that, but I can't fathom why, an ally would do something like that on purpose. And since so many people are killed in friendly fire within militaries, I think it's perfectly possible, if not likely, that that would be the case here.
So was the mistake because they thought it was an Egyptian ship? Is that your
Yeah, or
okay.
that, absolutely.
All right, thanks.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Question concerning leadership in both Israel and the United States. Leadership in Israel, as I would classify it, is old guard. They've pretty much come along since the founding of the state. Is there a new group coming up, as we have in our country with Obama and others? We have the next generation. And with the United States and the leadership here, I see a dichotomy where our presidential leadership is very pro two-state solution, but because of the influence of the Jewish lobby within the United States and the pressure they can exert on the Congress, there hasn't been that political will for the congressional version of the two-state. You see it at the presidential, but not at the congressional. Could you comment on both of those, please?
Yeah, absolutely, two great questions. So the first question is, yeah, you have, because it's such a young country in Israel, and in Palestinian politics too, because it's such a young, both young national movements and state in the making for the Palestinians, that you have essentially the George Washington, so to speak, of the country, or their like around, who have dominated the politics. And some people argue that there are pluses and minuses in that. The plus with someone like Yitzhak Rabin or Shimon Peres, who's now 90 years old, the president of Israel, and extremely respected around the world as a statesman, is they have the legitimacy as the forefathers of the country to make real concessions, and people will trust them and trust that the security of the country will not be compromised. So that's on the plus side. On the negative side, again, I would argue, and that's my bias, but especially if it's leaders from the Likud party, it might make them more staunch in terms of the ideology to be more reluctant to make some concessions towards a solution, although that's really changing, as a lot of people in the Likud party left and branched off to center parties like Kadima, and there's strong factions in the Likud party that now support a two-state solution. So the right has shifted to the center, so to speak, a lot of it. But you're right, on the more hopeful side is you have a younger generation. Ehud Barak, even though he's now in his 60s, and Netanyahu in his 60s, were of that second generation of leaders. And on the plus side, I think for Netanyahu, is therefore they're also more amenable. They care a lot more about public opinion polls, and they're less ideologically committed than the forefathers were. So it does make them, with a combination of perhaps American and internal pressure, likely to make concessions in order to appease public opinion. And so there is hope there, both on the Israeli and Palestinian side at times. In terms of the Israel lobby, I think that more often than not, of course, you have three divides in the Israel lobby right now. So you want to be careful not to treat it as one body, right? But you have the kind of J Street, Americans for Peace Now, kind of Jews and others more on the left who are strongly pushing Israel to freeze settlements and to more urgently pursue a peace agreement, and are for supporting Israel but also pressuring Israel to get there. Then you have AIPAC, as some people describe as more in the center, who's one of the stronger, more traditional lobbies, who's not anti-two-state solution at all, by the way. Most of its members support a two-state solution. But their philosophy is that whoever is elected in Israel needs to be supported by them. So when it's a government like that's a labor government or a Kadima government, they're supporting the government in trying to reach a peace agreement. When it's a Netanyahu government, then they often oppose pressuring Israel on settlements or something like that, and that could be seen as an obstacle to getting a two-state solution. So at times it could be perceived as doing that, at times not. I'm not, though, and then you have a third, the World Zionist Organization, that maybe has more members who actually oppose a two-state solution. But I would argue that the vast majority of our representatives in Congress and every administration we've had in a bipartisan fashion has supported a two-state solution. So I'm not of the ilk that think that U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East and even towards Israel is dictated by lobby groups. But I think foreign policy, having worked in the Pentagon and having worked in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I think that the foreign policy is largely made within a foreign policy elite within the administration. That certainly Congress can influence on issues like settlements, but I think that the drive towards a two-state solution is usually not inhibited by Congress, except for at times on the issue of settlements, is what my opinion would be.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a number of questions via text, so I want to see if we can get through a good portion of them. But the first question is, what is the likelihood of Israel attacking Iran if they indeed create nuclear warheads? And what implications does that attack have on the U.S.? Will U.S. militarily support Israel?
Yeah, that's certainly an important question. A lot of us political scientists are a lot better at explaining things that happened in the past than predicting things that will happen in the future, and we're always on shaky ground when we try to predict. So I think the chances were higher for a possible Israeli military strike before this interim agreement with Germany, Russia, China, the US, France, and England. So it's less likely now than it was before the inter-agreement, and less likely now that there are negotiations over a comprehensive agreement than before. I think now the climate is such, and there's some progress being made in the interim agreement, that it would be foolhardy, I think, at this point, no matter what you think before, you could think it's foolhardy before, but that the costs would be even higher to Israel acting alone under the current circumstances. So you never know. And again, as I've said, there are many in Israel's military and intelligence establishment that would be wary, certainly, of doing things alone without the United States. And the United States has made it clear that it doesn't want Israel to be acting alone. Now, if there were to be, some kind of military attack, that then it's likely that it would send its proxies, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah, to attack Israel in response. Now they have over 100,000 missiles in between them, more than many states that now have the range of hitting Tel Aviv and Israel's population centers. So that would be a real risk to Israelis. Would the United States do anything to that happen? I really don't know. I think it would certainly give a lot of political support to Israel. Often it's intentionally on both ends built Israel's military to the extent that it can take care of itself so that it won't have to be pulled in. So I think it's probably unlikely it would be pulled in because of the military aid it's given to Israel, that it won't need to rely on the United States, but perhaps, you never know.
I'm reminded of what Ehud Barak said at one point, that, they'd rather have Canada as a neighbor, but they don't. Go ahead.
And then also, concerning the divide in Jerusalem between Israel and Palestinians, what is the cultural climate? Are tensions high, or is long-term cohabitation without violence possible?
Yeah, in Jerusalem itself, of course, you have a large Jewish population. In West Jerusalem, that's within the 1967 borders, and it's practically all Jewish. That's where all the government buildings are. They're kind of DC-like things in West Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is where all the holy sites are, of course, for the three monotheistic religions, and you have a larger Palestinian population. Of course, Palestinians want East Jerusalem as Al-Quds, their capital. Many Israeli governments have been willing to concede most of East Jerusalem to a Palestinian capital. So if you look at Ehud Barak in 2000, 2001, and President Ehud Olmert in 2008, they were both willing to concede most of East Jerusalem to a Palestinian state. Netanyahu says he's not. So that certainly is going to be a source of friction in the negotiations, and there might be room for creative solutions. We'll see, but that will be a tough one to crack with Netanyahu. There are tensions in the city, but largely speaking, there is very limited violence. People get along pretty well, despite the tensions over the future of the city. 3 million tourists a year come to Jerusalem. They wouldn't be coming if it was dangerous. I know I lead a study abroad program in Jerusalem quite frequently, and MSU is legally responsible for students and goes through a huge risk assessment every 2 years to make sure it's safe enough, and indeed it is. So if you ever want to go to Jerusalem. I think it's the most beautiful and interesting city in the world. So I would recommend you to go, and there is tension there, but there's a lot of diversity, a lot of history, and it's very interesting.
It's a fascinating place, the old city, that there's so much conflict in such a very small area where the holiest site in Judaism is very close to one of the holiest sites in Christianity, and then the third holiest site in Islam, all perhaps within half a mile of each other.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I don't think many people realize
Yeah, the old
that.
city with a lot of the holy sites is just a kilometer, and as you suggest, unfortunately, in terms of geography, the one of the holiest Jewish sites, which is the Western or Wailing Wall, which is the supporting wall to their ancient temple 2,000 years ago that was destroyed first by Babylonians, then by the Romans, is adjacent to the platform, which is about 3 football fields where their temple used to be, and where now 2 beautiful mosques are, and one is at the site, the third holiest Muslim site, where Muhammad is supposed to have risen to heaven. So these things are right adjacent to each other, which is a real problem. In prior negotiations under the Clinton parameters, they were thinking of having the Jewish quarter and the Western Wall being part of Israel, and the mosques, or Haram al-Sharif, and the Jewish and Christian quarters go to Palestine. But there are different visions for both dividing and sharing the city simultaneously. So,
Okay. We're going to ask this gentleman who's been so patient for his question.
With Hamas in control of Gaza, how does that affect a possible two-state solution? Is a two-state solution possible with Hamas in control of Gaza?
I think it is, but again, I'm an eternal optimist. But I think the way people envision it, the way the United States and the EU and the UN and the Arab League. I was going to mention another reason why the relationship is just going to get stronger was that Saudi Arabia in 2002 made the dramatic overture, which the Arab League repeatedly supported, to accept Israel in the region and normalize relations within Israel if there were peace agreements between Israel and the Palestinian Authority and Israel and Syria, putting it more or less in the 67 borders. Sorry that I'm digressing. I'll get to your question. Secretary of State Kerry brought recently lots of Arab foreign ministers to Washington. They reiterated their commitment to the Arab Peace Initiative, and even made a concession that it didn't have to be exactly on the 67 borders, but based on the 67 borders with swaps, which is where the parties are right now. So because the Arab League supports a two-state solution, essentially under certain circumstances, the US, Russia, the EU, the UN as bodies, the Palestinian Authority, and the Israeli governments, I think that's kind of the institutional path we're on. Now, how's that going to happen with Hamas, which opposes a two-state solution, ruling the Gaza Strip? That's a very good question and certainly concerns many Israelis. One possibility that the Palestinian Authority has talked about, and Abu Mazen has talked about, and some Hamas leaders have talked about, is that Israel would negotiate a peace agreement with the Palestinian Authority. Then once they had a peace agreement, Palestinians would be allowed to vote on it. And if the majority of Palestinians voted for it, Hamas says that it won't spoil the peace process, as it intentionally did in the past, by the way. It intentionally put suicide bombers in Israel to destroy the peace process. But it says it will no longer spoil it, but it won't go against what the majority of Palestinians want. So that's certainly one avenue of getting there. Another avenue would be reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, which there have been several not entirely successful efforts at doing. But if there was a reconciliation, on one hand, it would make it more difficult to reach a peace agreement, but on the other hand, it would make it easier to implement a peace agreement once one is reached. So I think the basic hope is that Hamas will decide that even though they don't support a two-state solution, they will go along with it and not kind of try to undermine it.
Well,
that's the hope.
Will they allow a legitimate vote in Gaza Strip?
That's another concern question, since there have been no elections in the Gaza Strip since they took over in 2007. They imprison Fatah supporters. Fatah in the West Bank imprisons a lot of Hamas leaders and supporters. So certainly it's an open question whether there'd be fair and free referendum in the Gaza Strip, and perhaps there would be a need for international monitors there to make sure that it was fair and free.
Okay, we have another question, please.
Actually, a follow-up to a couple of things you've already stated and then a question. The follow-up is you had stated that the parameters of the eventual settlement are fairly well laid out. You've then mentioned East Jerusalem twice.
Right.
Are the parameters of East Jerusalem fairly well set out? And then the follow-up or the separate question is, we hear today a lot about the boycott. It was in the Wall Street Journal today. Secretary of State Kerry mentioned it recently. How efficacious do you think that is to resolving the situation in the Middle East?
Okay, great question. So the boycott was the last one. The first one I have a cold, maybe that's my excuse, yeah? East Jerusalem, thank you. So East Jerusalem, not with Netanyahu, but with Ehud Olmert in 2008. Ehud Olmert and Abu Mazen in 2008 agreed on much of where the borders would be in East Jerusalem, which comes off of the Clinton parameters, which means there are Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, some of which have been there for 80 years, that would remain part of Israel. The Palestinian neighborhoods and the Christian and Muslim quarters of the Old City would become Al-Quds, the Palestinian capital. So they agree on that. They at times disagree on which major settlement blocks near Jerusalem would remain in Israel and which would have to be evacuated and be in Palestine. So Abu Mazen has agreed that Israel could keep 2% of the West Bank and swap an equivalent piece and value of land in pre-1967 land back to Palestine, so that in a sense, Palestine would get 100% of the equivalence of the land, but some of the 2% would be within 67 borders that's transferred, and 2% would be outside of 67 borders that Israel could keep, which would allow it to not have to evacuate most of the settlers that live in 3 settlement blocks. So it would evacuate most of the settlements that are spread across the West Bank that are small, but it would keep 2 or 3 of the major settlement blocks, like Ma'ale Adumim, and they differed on one of those. I know Ariel they differed on. So but they were reaching almost a conclusion as to exactly where the lines would be on East Jerusalem. As to the question is, what is the best method for people to try to pressure either Israel and or the Palestinian Authority to reach a peace agreement? I don't think that boycotts are the answer, personally, in this circumstance. most governments, university presidents in the U.S., et cetera, also don't see it as the main element. Why, right? One reason is you have to look under the circumstances under which it might work or not work, right? In the Israeli case, I would argue, what is the main reason that people fear making concessions? Is it because it's a monster? Is it because it's malicious and it just likes to have people suffer? Is it because most Israelis are expansionists who just want extra kilometer of land? I would say no. I would say most Israelis fear. They're operating out of fear. Why? Most of them are refugees themselves. There are some Holocaust survivors there. There are some people, up to 1 million people, who were kicked out of many states in the Middle East that they had lived for either 600 years or 3,000 years, whether it be Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Egypt, etc. So that they were kicked out of these countries. They suffered a lot. Therefore, they're distrustful of what will happen to them. You have people who walked for days from Ethiopia, having their relatives die on the way, reaching Sudanese refugee camps, who then were flown to Israel. So you're dealing with a lot of people who are refugees themselves and who haven't had a day of peace in their lives. They've been attacked, and even now when Israel's at peace, there's almost not a week that goes by that a rocket doesn't come into Israel. That doesn't mean that I'm very critical of some of Israeli policies, but you have to look at who you're dealing with. And when you're dealing with a population that still has Al-Qaeda-linked groups now on its border with Syria, Hezbollah on its border with Lebanon, Islamic Jihad and Hamas on its border in terms of Gaza, and now the Sinai Strip is not governed by Egypt but by Al-Qaeda-like groups in the Sinai, it's still dealing with serious security things, and so it's still in a vulnerable meaning beating it over the head I don't think is going to work. It's mostly reaching out to it and saying, as Obama did when he came to the country, and saying, we understand your security concerns, we understand your fears. Obama, when he went to Sderot, said, if my daughter was here, I'd be concerned with rockets coming in all the time. I think it's more, now you need sometimes a mix, of course, of diplomacy, pressure, and carrots, but I don't think that just banging Israel over the head and saying you don't get any economic aid will work. Secondly, I don't think it's a very principled argument in my mind either, because often the people who are pro-boycotts are not calling to boycott any other country on earth but Israel. And to me, that's problematic, because you need to have some kind of consistent criteria by which you boycott countries based on human rights violations. So would you boycott Syria because over 100,000 people died? Would you boycott Saudi Arabia because women are allowed to bike or drive? Would you boycott Turkey because it occupies northern Cyprus and has killed a lot of Kurds? Would you the list becomes dozens of countries that have severe human rights violations and or are occupying other parts, whether it's China with Tibet, whether it's Russia with Chechnya, etc. So if you only single out the tiny country of 8 million people, that's the only country on earth that's mostly Jewish, it raises questions. Why only Israel? Why aren't you considering other countries? So I have a problem with it. What I find less problematic, and luckily I don't think it's getting a whole lot of momentum, what I think is less problematic is boycotting products that are made in settlements. I think there's a greater legitimate debate to be had over that, and whether you would boycott a company whose products are made in settlements in the West Bank as opposed to boycott Israel as a whole. And interestingly enough, by the way, Nelson Mandela very recently said he was against boycotting Israel, and he's coming from the South African experience. And Abu Mazen, the Palestinian elected leader, is against boycotting Israel. He says, you know, maybe products from settlements, but not the country as a whole that we recognize and that we're negotiating with. So those are some reasons that I would find it problematic.
Thank you. Oh, another question.
If you have time.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Does Netanyahu have political cover with his background a la Nixon and China to have a better chance to make peace?
Yeah, I think, you know, in some ways he does. I hate to admit the adage that sometimes it's the hawk or the hardliner that makes the deal, whether it's Nixon in China, whether it's Begin and Sadat in 1979. It was a Likud leader who signed the first major Israeli peace agreement with a neighbor. So I'm sometimes reluctant, given my own politics, to admit that. But I think a case can be made that it's harder for Netanyahu to make sometimes the concessions that will be necessary, I think, to reach an agreement. But if he decided to, he'd be more likely to gain broader support among the public to be able to implement it because of his history of emphasizing to such an extent Israeli security and being so skeptical of the motivations of the Palestinian leadership. So it's a trade-off.
Okay.
Well, this will have to be our last question. Yeah, so go ahead.
Hi. I understand what you're saying about not singling out one country for boycott, but in some ways we have singled out Israel as like the single largest recipient of military aid. And I keep coming back to that $3 billion a year or $3.1 billion or whatever it is, and the fact that so much of that is spent in the United States for American products. To what extent do you think this policy of supporting Israel and spending billions of taxpayer dollars on military is based on some sort of support of a military-industrial complex in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a legitimate question, and certainly the question would be, okay, I think legitimately, as you say, well, one reason to pay special attention to Israel is because of the special aid, military aid we have for Israel, and then thinking through that lens, and I think that's a legitimate point. I guess, first of all, again, even with military aid, I would see Israel as not isolated, because if you're going to look at military aid, you also have to look at the billions and billions of dollars that we spend on Saudi Arabia. With Saudi Arabia, unlike all Israelis who like America, practically 35% of Saudis have a positive opinion of the United States. About 35% of Americans have a positive opinion about Saudis. They also have their own real human rights violations, whether it's gender, whether it's Shiites, a minority in their population, etc. So then you'd have to question military aid to Saudi Arabia. You'd have to question military aid to Turkey and our NATO alliance with Turkey, since it also occupies northern Cyprus, has killed a lot of Kurds, discriminates against Kurds, and now really has challenges to its own democratic system. You'd have to question the billions of dollars we spend at different years over the past decade, more so than to Israel, on Pakistan, right? A country, parts of whose intelligence and military bodies are aiding the Taliban intentionally and are working at odds at times with U.S. interests, who on one hand allow U.S. drones, but on the other hand, privately, on the other hand, vocally against it, and who the bottom line is we give them billions of dollars in military and economic aid, but when we have our number one enemy that we're trying to catch, who's very nicely living next to their military training base in a middle-class neighborhood, we don't trust them enough to share that intelligence with them and let them know about it, right? So these are the allies that we're giving billions of dollars of. So again, I wouldn't treat Israel in isolation, but would say, okay, are any of these countries, or all of these countries worth giving military aid to? What is the purpose of the military aid? To what extent is it aiding U.S. security? You can perhaps make an argument or not with Saudi Arabia and with Pakistan in terms of how grave a threat you think Iran is in balancing Iran, or how grave a threat you think al-Qaeda in Pakistan is right now, et cetera, right? So I think with Israel, that aid perhaps could diminish in the future were the U.S. and Iran to form a better relationship, were more democracies to be created in the region, therefore you have less instability in the region, and Israel may need less aid. Israel is economically doing better, may need less aid. But ultimately, I think, and it's what you think of allies, right? Our allies we're supporting. And I guess where I'm coming from is I still think if the U.S. wants to be a leader in the world, and if it wants not to overextend itself in the world, it still has to rely, and if it doesn't want to put boots on the ground in the world, it still has to rely on its allies in order to further its interests in the world. And in that respect, I think Israel still faces real security threats from Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and on its Sinai border.
Just to chime in, though, but what I was raising was the question of whether that's really about supporting allies or whether it's about supporting American corporations.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's a tension there. I mean, I think it's mostly allies, but certainly I don't know as much as I should about the different companies that make these. Having worked in the Pentagon, I know there's a lot of corruption and the prices are inflated, and certainly you could argue that there needs to be more competition, and certainly these companies perhaps are making too much profit, et cetera. So that's a whole question that would need to be, I think, supervised as in any aid program. You'd have to have real supervision as to whether the money is being used efficiently and wisely, and whether there's enough companies competing for it, et cetera. But I think we'd all want to move to a world where that military aid would no longer be necessary. And maybe, right, I mean, if we get a better relationship with Iran, if more democracies are established in the region, there won't be a need for as much military aid to Saudi Arabia or Israel.
We can be hopeful.
Yeah.
Well, what an excellent, excellent presentation. It's so comprehensive. Let's thank Dr. Aronoff.
Thank you.